you know how I get sometimes about the Americans. You
Mm-hmm.
know, you've you
Yes.
know, and
Mm-hmm.
my pain also, particularly at Black American culture,
Mm-hmm.
which gets me raging and whatever. And I was a
Mm-hmm.
bit like, oh, there I go again. I said to her, do you have a gun? And she said, that she has this constant conversation with her partner.
Mm-hmm.
Something happens, and then they have this huge discussion. Should we, shouldn't we? Should we, shouldn't we? Should we, shouldn't
Mm-hmm.
we? And that we're all getting older. So she said, we keep coming back to we're not having one in the house.
Right.
And in such a culture, I find that such a brave decision
Mm-hmm.
and
Yep.
admirable.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, you need to leave that country and come here,
Right.
right? Come here.
Yeah.
Like, there are so many Americans moving into Amsterdam, and really, I fucking
Really.
hate it. I
Really.
hate it. Just because Americans grow up in a monoculture that they think is so diverse, and
Right.
they are cultural colonists,
Mm-hmm.
colonialists.
Mm-hmm.
They come in and they want stuff to be like it is in America. They
Right.
come over and they transplant
Mm-hmm.
that culture here. So what is it? They
Mm-hmm.
have all of these groups, all of these expat groups
Right.
where
Right.
they
I
come
heard.
in and it's like expatica, you know? All they're
Mm.
doing is trying to impose
Mm-hmm.
cultural norms that are actually really abhorrent,
Mm-hmm.
Sorry. Like if you think of any like food, fat because I like food.
Right.
Too much sugar in everything Americans make.
Mm-hmm. I noticed that with the
Too
soft drinks here and when I've traveled overseas, how much less sugar is in, let's say, a Coke or a Fanta when I was in either France or even DR. But here it's like sugar, the whole thing is sugar.
right? And you need to
Mm-hmm.
understand that sugar's massively addictive,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's also a
Yeah.
slave-based crop. To this day, the
Mm-hmm.
people who create sugar are in economic slavery. So
Mm-hmm.
having a nation the size of America addicted to the levels of sugar that you have means that every
Mm-hmm.
Black person who is basically undermining,
Mm-hmm.
attacking every other Black person who's enslaved to produce
Mm.
that crop.
Wow. Never thought about that. I never thought about that. Like how we're getting it.
Right?
Wow.
So if you look at that like the whole history of slavery, like basically the vast majority of slaves were actually, people are going to shoot me when I say this, but had better lives because they had food, right? They
Mm-hmm.
might, they had food, they had decent housing, they had clothing provided. So your vast majority of slaves across the world, in the Caribbean, in the Americas, had better basic life circumstances than your average um, working class, poor peasant European.
Hmm.
Conditions that your average European lived in at the time of slavery, they didn't, were worse than on most
Hmm.
plantations.
Hmm.
Nobody wants to address that. Nobody wants to look at that,
I've never really looked into it, to be honest.
right? So in
Mm-hmm.
particular, like somewhere like the Netherlands, if you
Mm-hmm.
look at how their lowest class were treated, the conditions that they lived in. If you look at Dickensian England, and
Mm-hmm.
if you look at France, and the conditions that led to the French Revolution, and then
Mm-hmm.
every now and again you see these little things of like these little rows of houses with people in
Right.
dresses and no, they didn't have shoes, but they're not having winters like we did in
Mm-hmm.
Europe, like we do in Europe,
Okay.
you know?
Wow.
So, when I'm looking at and I'm hearing Black Americans about how oppressed they are, and I'm like, I'm not saying you guys didn't have it shitty.
Mm-hmm.
You did. But the space that you've come to on the basis of that is really ill-informed.
Hmm.
Like
Mm-hmm.
they captured working class, like peons, the indentured, the serfs of
Right.
Europe, by giving them tea and sugar and tobacco. And it's
Mm-hmm.
because they made them addicted to those substances that they were allowed to do the slave trade. So I come from the country where people went,
Mm-hmm.
this has to stop. You know, black
Right.
people are people. You know,
Mm-hmm.
the British were the first to end the slave trade, and
Yes.
that was a call that
Yes.
came from ordinary people going,
Mm-hmm.
we're not having this.
Right.
You know, right? The Dutch imported very few slaves to this country, very few. The British imported way more. And as
Mm-hmm.
soon as they interacted with ordinary people, and ordinary people were like, this is a person just like me,
Right.
you know, that's where that came from. So the whole
Mm-hmm.
history, the whole way that people are treated, you know, like every black person in America has white British people to thank for the end of
Mm-hmm.
slavery.
Well, I got in trouble one day. I said, you know what, could this have been, we have been better off had the United States remained a colony?